Namaste and welcome to this digital exclusive. I have Sandeep Balakrishna, founder of the Dharma Dispatch. Rohit Chakratirtha is with us, and he's the one who stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest in Karnataka, but uh, but perhaps for the right reasons, and try and understand the right perspective. We'll also have Dushan Sridhar, Vedic speaker, writer, and also filmmaker, joining us at this point. And the whole idea, ladies and gentlemen, is to try. Uh, Somebody's got a lot of background noise behind them. So yeah. So the whole idea, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand why we need to rewrite a lot of the history that's being taught, not just history, but a lot of the other ways, methods with which we are being instructed, the core principles of education. But let's start with history. It all started with Tipu Sultan. So Rohitji, namaskara. I'm going to ask you, uh,
Yeah,
how did you arrive at the aspect of de-glorifying certain, I won't even say icons, certain figurines of our history and their contributions to India and the way they have been portrayed? Let's start from there and then take it forward.
yeah. See, when we started our revision process of textbooks, one of the criteria we had was that whatever we are presenting, it should have some this thing, historical evidence, historical support. So if there is no evidence, no support, then we used to like keep it aside and like we used to go for a recheck. And we had a team of experts. So they have gone through a lot of books and even other facts and evidences. So if there is no support for any claim, then that particular item has been dropped. So one of the questions that I have raised in one of the programs recently is that who has given the title Tiger of Mysore? I myself have gone through a lot of records. I think even Sandeep Balakrishna would know
Yes.
uh, that none of the scriptures, none of the texts are saying that he has been called by anybody as Tiger of Mysore. So this title was given by some eminent historian somewhere in 1950s, and probably after that it has been inserted in the textbooks. This is one of the instances. Like this, there are many instances where some titles, some exaggerated things have been incorporated in the textbooks just because it has been told by somebody. There is no historical evidence whatsoever. Let me give you one more example. There was one chapter on Vedic times, and in that chapter, some 2-3 pages of personal opinion had been written by the previous revision committee head, Professor Bargur Ramchandrappa. Now, most of those things were just personal opinions. There were no historical facts whatsoever. So,
Hmm.
wherever such kind of things are lacking, we have just removed such claims. So, we have remained true to the facts. Wherever there are facts, wherever there are some historical support, only
Hmm.
those kind of items have been retained in the textbook, and whatever exaggeration or glorification has been done by earlier committee has been completely dropped off.
Hmm. I understand, but why is it? There is a larger question, and I want to dwell on that also. And Sandeep Balakrishna, I want to start with you. I read somewhere that just about 115 years ago, a Kotwal asked a teacher in Udupi, and I say this quite often. A Kotwal asked a teacher in Udupi, "How do you teach? What is your method of instruction?" Just about 115, 116 years ago, and this teacher said, in his village, the largest banyan tree, under that I teach them Vedic science, Vedic maths, and the method of instruction is Sanskrit. So after 1947, even if you were to say history is written from the eyes of the victor, after 1947, we should have written our history, and our method of instruction should be what is core to us, what is core to Bharata. How come that has not happened, Sandeep? And why? You've just recently penned an article on why the Pandit's system of learning, memorizing and the sharpness. We forgot, we don't do all of that now. Yeah, Sandeep, go ahead, please. You're not audible to me. You're not audible to me. Sandeep, you're not audible to me, Sandeep. I can't hear you. Uh, check. Yeah, now go ahead, please. You're on mute now. Sandeep, you're on mute now. Sandeep, you're on mute. You're on mute now. I can't hear you. Can't hear you. Please unmute. Yeah, now. Now. Go ahead, please. Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, okay. I'm audible now? Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
So that's a very fundamental question, about the system of Indian education, that the method of instruction that you spoke about. This was an unbroken method for the last, 5,000, 7,000 years at the least. So teaching has always been, even formal teaching has been informal. It was conducted largely in an intimate environment where the teacher was not merely a teacher in the sense that he was also a member of the family, and he used to look after the students' welfare, unless this mass herding of students, young children, into classrooms, building concrete structures like cattle. That's unfortunately become the model. So, in such a system, over the earlier, for the longest time, yes, you were right partially about the medium of language of instruction was Sanskrit, but that was no longer the case as our culture and other languages evolved. But in its essentials, both the method of teaching and even although language of instruction might be different, the method and the mode have largely remained the same. The
Same.
emphasis basically was, on the proverbial 3 R's that was also there. But more than anything, education was regarded as a wholesome activity instead of looking at each subject in isolation. So the emphasis on memory was extraordinary in the sense that in your formative years, from your childhood all the way up to your adulthood, your memory is extremely sharp, which is verifiable by all of us in our experience. So it is said that by the time you put a kid in school, when he was, say, 6 years or 7 years, and by the time he matured as an adult at about 16, 17, 18, he would have at his command a vocabulary of not less than 12,000 words on the tip of
Correct.
his tongue. So imagine a repository available at your command, that vast vocabulary at your command. Uh, and the meanings, they're not just meanings, and their applications. Right? For example, tattva, a word, tattva,
Yeah.
might mean differently. It has different meanings in different contexts. Right?
Correct.
So it's true. Just because, see, for example, just because I can read and write English doesn't mean that I can read a medical textbook and perform an open heart surgery. So you can't, unlike today's micro specialization where each subject is treated, almost in isolation. Our education took a wholesome view.
Correct.
So unfortunately, that was a great strength of perfection of what is today known as, this has come through the back door as something called a new fancy word called immersion. So this was thoroughness. That sort of education would stay with you till your death, or you lose your mind,
Correct.
basically. So it would
Correct.
never
But
leave.
then, so one is the
Yeah.
method of instruction and the kind of instruction, but along with that, Sandeep, also the text, what was being instructed, what was being taught. Now you are somebody whose blood should boil every time a child says who's Tipu Sultan is Sher of Mysore. You've also written extensively about it. But how is it
No
that
doubt.
those who became the education ministers, who became the founding fathers, and thereafter decided what this nation should study, how this nation should study, medium of
Hmm.
instruction in schools, how will they, or how
Hmm.
did they allow this to happen? A total dilution of our history, and also being taught from the perspective of whom
Hmm.
we won against.
Yeah.
It's not from our perspective. We are the victors here, but it's not from our perspective.
Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Uh, there's a lot, yeah. So there's a lot of ground you have covered. I'll see how much I can address. So the first thing about, how did we allow these historians and all these guys who took over,
Historians.
virtually
That's a nice name.
yeah, so virtually usurped our education system. So nobody allowed that. So that's one of the great myths of it. midst of a lot of things connected to both our freedom struggle and what happened after 1947. So it was a virtual coup or a takeover, right? So power to the Congress party was handed down on the platter. There was no free and fair elections in 1947, right? So who recognized the Congress party as a de facto ruling power? Themselves did. And with the halo that had built up, as that we are the sole arbiters, and we are the people who've exclusively got freedom for this country. So a lot of these things have to be unraveled. But coming back to your thing, a lot of the Indian masses place their look. You have to travel back to the understand the Indian psyche of that time. It was a naive and a largely trusting audience, citizenship in India that existed at that time. That someone who would rule us, who would sit in positions of power and authority, were expected, were trusted, intrinsically trusted to do good by them,
Yeah.
to look out for them, to look out for welfare. And this trust was, it came as part of the Hindu cultural inheritance, that
Correct.
Rajaha Prajavatsalaha, meaning the king is akin to a father to the subject. So this was what enabled these people to occupy power, and what they did with that, they pretty much we know that story. So even under the British, for example, whatever the divide and rule policy and the detrimental social economic operation that they did in the realm of education, they had pretty much left it alone. And I
Yeah.
say this with a great sense of accountability and responsibility. If you look at all those historical researches that, for example, the ASI did, all these Oriental journals that they did, both British scholars and Indian scholars who were also employed there, then each time some British or Western scholar would, give a mischievous interpretation to Hindu history, our scholars would rebut them and they would take it and they would correct themselves. So
Yeah.
it was a healthy atmosphere of genuine and honest scholarship. This was destroyed. So a
Yeah.
good movement was built up in, rediscovering our past, writing the truths about our past for what I call the century of the modern Indian Renaissance, which roughly began in the early part of the middle portion of the 19th century, all the way ending, culminating in the mid 20th century. So this was a golden period of the modern Indian Renaissance. So all the good work that had been work that was these great scholars was criminally made to disappear, and this new establishment, headed by the,
Right.
for God's sake, who makes someone like Maulana Kalam Azad the first education minister? I mean, this is a travesty of criminal proportions. So obviously, they would write history or alleged history on expected lines. So Nehru, for example, he patronized this man, and who was the source of Nehru's learning of Indian history? Muhammad Habib, who for the first time he hailed Mahmud Ghazni as a hero and a liberator, and he gave this whole fictitious and this spurious theory of the motivation of Islamic invasion of India. He seeded the theory that these invasions were motivated by the by loot and plunder, and he goes to the
Yeah.
extent of writing that who asked Hindu temples to store so much of wealth? It would attract robbers and plunderers. This is the reasoning he gave.
No,
This is in black and
this
white.
is how. No, I understand, but Sandeep, what they've done is they've spun the narrative in such a way that they made us believe it is all our fault, Rohit Chakratirtha.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah, yeah.
before I bring in Dushyant Sridhar, and Dushyant's been patiently waiting, but I just want to come to you, Rohit, and ask you: are you doing this for a political reason because elections are just 6 months down the line, as many are alleging, or is this something which you've been wanting to work on, and right now, you believe this is the right time since COVID restrictions are over, and you can actually push through some of these reforms? So where is this coming from?
See, let me give you a brief about how this revision process has happened. In 2014, there were a new set of textbooks. They were written on the basis of NCF 2005. Now, when the textbooks were, they were out in 2014, the government changed. So we had Siddaramaia's Congress government. The moment the Congress took power, the first thing they did was changing the textbooks. So Siddaramaiah himself, he formed a committee led by Barku Ramchandrappa, and he told these textbooks must be revised. Now, in the name of revision, what they did was a lot of lies were included, lot of, their personal opinions were included, and lot of ideological changes were, incorporated. A lot of things were done for 3 years. So he had a committee of about 180 people. He had a team of 180 people, and those people they did the majority of changes in social studies textbook. So in 2017, we had these revised textbooks, and there itself we found the problems. So I was the probably one of the first few people who actually raised our voice against this revised textbooks. So we actually listed out a lot of items that were factually errors, factual mistakes, and like deviations and personal opinions and all that. It was nothing to do with ideology, but still we have written down all kind of such deviations, and we started a campaign against these kind of revised textbooks. But the government was not ready to listen to us. So till 2019, Siddaramaiah was rolling, and he was very reluctant to do any kind of changes. So when 2019, when the government changed, again we started telling these kind of textbooks must be completely banned. So we have to go back to the original textbooks. But again, the present government has taken 3-4 years to do any kind of move. And only recently, 2021 September, they formed a committee, official committee, and they put me as the chairman for the committee. And we had about 15 people in the committee, and we went through the textbooks. And what the government had told us is, wherever there is any deviation, or if any particular community has been targeted, only those kind of things must be changed. So we did not have the freedom of changing the entire textbook completely. So we had a time limit. So within 4-5 months, we had to give a report, and we had a very limited resources. We had only 15 people in our hand. So with all these limitations, we had to work on this kind of this revised revision. And one thing I should tell you that from the beginning, the government, be it education minister or anybody from education department, has never asked even once that we have to target on any specific issue. So what they told is only you have to go through the entire textbook and see wherever there is some problem. I mean, problem in the sense not politically some issues. So if there is any historical this thing problem or deviations, only those things has to be addressed. So from the beginning, our education minister has not directed us in any particular way. So till today, he has not asked us to do any kind of changes in favor of him or in favor of the party. So this was completely apolitical. So we did not have any intention of gaining any political this thing from textbooks. And even, let me tell you, the topic of Tipu was not, center of discussion. As in the process, we have touched Tipu. We have done some corrections in the chapter on Tipu. But Tipu was not the center of any debate for us. We have done all these kind of corrections, even in the case of Mughals, even in the case of Tughlaq, even in the case of Devis and all that. But I don't know why Tipu has gained so much currency here. Maybe because more than BJP, I think it is Congress which is, in the need of this kind of topic. So they always, they're in the look of some hot topic. So probably.
Not just that, Rohit. What I see is also that, when I have spoken to Vinay Sahasrabudheji, he is heading the committee which is looking at reforms of under the education policy at the center. He's had more than 7,000 representations which are showing factually how our textbooks are all wrong, distorted across subjects, and also especially history, social studies, etc.
Let me just add one this thing to you. So when these textbooks were revised by Dr. Barku Ramchandrappa, there was one booklet by NCRT. They published an 80-page booklet compilation of all the errors that were included in the
Yeah.
textbooks. So, can you imagine? There was a booklet by NCRT which had a list of all the errors errors in the textbook. So, it was about like 80 pages.
My
We are
God.
not even talking about ideology difference. We are talking about the factual errors.
Factual errors, correct. So it's not about ideology, but irony. The irony is that as long as the distortion is for appeasement, it is to try and create a certain sense of what they term as balance. It's all okay. But history is supposed to be a fact. It's supposed to be a commentary of
Exactly.
what occurred and the reality and a reflection of our society so that people know where we come from, what we have endured, how we have evolved, and what we should be actually proud of. But somewhere, Dushyant Sridhar, we have been made to be apologetic about it. So much so that if somebody tries to correct it, we have to resist it. Because we are conditioned to say, oh no, please don't correct it. Otherwise, what will happen to certain sections of society? How will they feel? Look how we've been conditioned. History is history. If this was done, it was done. If Brahmins were hung from trees and they were cut, or Nambudri Brahmins were targeted, they were targeted. If Kodavas were targeted, they were targeted. That's the reality of Karnataka history. Rani Chennamma is the reality of, of Kannada history. If there was a rampant, conversion drive which happened in Coorg because the Britishers wanted to set up their coffee plantations and they went about convert, that's a reality. As much as the Vijayanagara kingdom is. Yes, Tushar.
Namaskaram, Anand, and namaskaram to my fellow panelists. With just a preface that I would like to set for this very, very brief discussion. While we speak about philosophies like Advaita, Visishta Advaita, and Dvaita, the premise in which the philosophers arrive at that philosophy are primarily three tools. One is called Pratyaksham, which is perception. Second is Anumanam, which is called as inference. And third is verbal testimony, which is the scriptures. Similarly, when history is drafted for students of history across the school education or college education to understand, the most important of them all are the inscriptions that you find on stone temple walls, and then you have stone tablets, and then you have copper inscriptions, like for Cinnamannur copper inscriptions. You will have Srirangam is, of course, the viewers should know, is one of the temples in India, in the Indian subcontinent, to have the maximum number of inscriptions. So then you will have verbal testimonies as well. For example, Ganga Devi in the 14th century, he wrote a beautiful Sanskrit poem called as Madhura Vijayam, where after the expedition in the 1323 by Ulugh Khan, who was later called as Muhammad bin Tughlaq, later Sayyid Jalaluddin Ahsan Khan, who established the Madurai Sultanate, he killed so many people, and all that has been chronicled in this beautiful Sanskrit poem where she tells how the heads of people were cut off and they were hung in the place of coconuts on the coconut trees in the south of India. So this is again to remove the perception that south of India did not suffer invasion. South of India also suffered the pains of invasion, but not as much as the people in the north suffered.
No.
So all this has been chronicled. So when history needs to be drafted in textbooks, either for school or colleges, the historians have to collate the inscriptions, the scriptural evidences first, and then draft. The personal opinion or the way they want to frame the sentences should come towards the end. But for us, it has happened the other way around. It is a premise set that if I say that a certain invader attacked this particular temple town, killed so many number of people, then what will happen to the people of that community, the invaders community today? Let's take in Bangalore, what will happen to the residents of Shivaji Nagara? What will happen to the temple people of Mumra in near Thane in the state of
Mumbai.
So that's the first fear that comes. No sane person, no human will hold my friend Abdul, who was just converted 2 generations back, for the atrocities committed by Sayyid Jalaluddin Ahsan Khan in 1336. So if we were a country with such inhumane people, we wouldn't be having so many religions in our country. But if historians take the premise that what will happen to the people today, then you can never present history. Then you should do away with history from schools and colleges. You don't need a chapter called history because your emotion is overtaking the evidences and the truth. So, first of all, when historians draft history, whether they be of the left, right, center to left, left to right, whatever it is, they will have to present however it is. Now, let's take a simple locality, Anand. While my friends from the northeast, the north of India, the west of India, or the south of India, if at all you happen to visit the capital of Tamil Nadu, which is Chennai, Chennai is very close to Kanchipuram and Mahabalipuram, which are centers of Pallava architecture, which
Yeah.
flourished between the 5th and the 9th century. So, if you visit the Chennai airport, which is in Meenambakam, right of Meenambakam, the first vicinity that you see is called Pallavaram. Pallavaram
Yeah.
is recorded as Pallavapuram. And in Pallavaram today, there is a central road, a very important road, which is called as Masjid Road. And in that Masjid Road, you find a very well decked masjid. And it is proven by historians of great repute in great journals that once you get inside the masjid, it is actually the Pancharathas of Mahabalipuram that you see again here of the 7th century. So the masjid is masjid from outside. When you get inside, it is the Pancharathas. So the road is called Masjid Road. It is a masjid, but when you get inside, it is the Pancharathas. It was never told to us unless and until you take the time to go into journals and then you see evidences and then understand, oh, this is a temple. Now, the moment I say this, people will think, okay, this is also going to be demolished. No. But why can't we present history the way it is? Not every masjid and every church is going to be demolished. No, we don't even know where we'll keep the debris, first of all. So all that is not going to happen, but present. So this reconciliation, if it has never happened with history, the victims, with respect to the invaders, then presenting history in schools and colleges doesn't make any sense at all, especially for a country like Bharata, which is India. I'll tell you why. Because history may not be, I'm not saying is not, may not be that important to the United States of America, because even if they have to trace history based on evidences, they can't cross 500 years. But
Correct.
here, even my great grandfather's house in the village is 150 years old. So imagine what kind of structures we have. So when we present history from a very ancient living civilization, again, when I say living civilization, not that there were no other civilizations, the Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian civilization, the Persian civilization, the Arabs before the advent of Islam, they were all older civilizations. But today we don't find that as a living civilization. We don't find evidences of what they spoke, what they worship today, because it's been dominated by religions of the West. But today, I still have the practices what was followed during the times of Kashyapa. If there is an Aruna Prashnam that says Kashyakaha Kashyapo Bhavati, it is being still recited in Mudigondan, a small village near Tanjavur in the south of India. So what happened in Kashmir, which is chronicled in the Vedic scriptures, is still recited. So for a living civilization like Bharata, which is the Vedic civilization, taking history to the textbooks the way it is very important, immaterial of whether it is one government or the other. And one final
Right.
point I'd like to make, Anand, whenever there is a government in a state, in the Indian state or the central government, whichever color be it, whichever party they belong to, immediately media personalities whom you are all friends with will talk about a word called as anti-incumbency. So the moment the government stays for 5 years, there is a certain ideology, there is a certain tone, there's a certain tenor to every government, be it of the center or the state. So once the elections are announced, immediately pundits will come and say, okay, this government may change, may not change. So people are able to tolerate this government after 5 years. No, people cannot tolerate this government after 5 years. So imagine for 5 years and 10 years, we are talking about the ideology and the color of a certain government. Right from the attack of the 11th century by Ghori and Ghazni till
Yeah.
about 18th century, we had one ideology ruling a large part of India. Of course, Chhatrapati Shivaji was there, the Vijayanagara dynasty came, but we had one ideology to stay in India for over 600 to 700 years. And if for 5 years and 10 years, we are all journalists come up with books, counter books, anti books, and so on. And for 800 years, we are not supposed to present history the way it is, because the people of a certain community or certain communities may feel a lot hurt. So if this
Yeah.
is the way we are going to deal, because people say, why should you go to 800 years? Talk about 70 years, talk about 20
Uh,
years. Who are we to decide what is the number that we have to go into history? So
uh,
if
uh,
yesterday happened, yesterday is history to me. 1,000 years
yes.
is history to me. So nobody can say these are the number of years that you can index. Like how you can say, about the calculation of properties worth, they'll say after 1993, if the property is bought. No, history doesn't work that way. 5,000 years is also history. 3,000
Uh,
years is also history. 1,000 years is also
uh,
history. And 70 years is also history. So
uh,
if history
uh,
has to be presented the way it is, people
uh,
who design the history should first of all have basic knowledge of the language in which the inscriptions are, because
uh,
most of our inscriptions, be it in the north or the south of India, are either in Sanskritam, Prakritam, certain places Pali, in certain places Grantham, and we have Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam inscriptions as well. But largely it centers around Sanskritam, Prakritam, Tamil, and Grantham. How many of
uh,
the historians can put their heads up high in the air and say, well, I know all these languages? They depend
correct.
on people who are going to translate for them, and the person
Correct.
who translates, Ram Ke Bharose, I don't know what he's going to do with those inscriptions.
No, but see, this it comes back to the same thing, Rohit. What you're endeavoring to do, I believe that it should have been done long back, irrespective of which political ideology. Because history should have been set from our point of view. Sandeep, I'm coming back to you with the same thing. How is it that this has been allowed? How is it that this has been allowed? That people who are invaders, those who are Akrantas, are glorified. Those who defended and stood up for their country with the idea of Mahabharati, even though they may be representing their own individual kingdoms and riyasats, they all came together because they realized that they belong to this land and this civilization. There was that recognition which happened. How is it that we have allowed that to be corrupted? Why should we be okay
Okay,
with it?
fantastic question. Fantastic question, Anand. I'll address that part first. I'll address that part first. So, the thing is, how is it that we've allowed this distortion to go on for so long and on this epic scale? So, yeah, this was the single handed work of the Marxists. Okay, until the Marxists took over the establishment, these distortions were limited to discussions and arguments, technical arguments, academic arguments about nuances and finer points. But on the major issues, major epochs, who did what, which Sultan destroyed which temple, there was unanimity. With the stranglehold and the usurpation of the Marxists, they began not only a multi-pronged approach was adopted. First was to even deny it. The second was to introduce falsehoods. The third was to distort events and incidents that had scholarly consensus until then. When I say until then, I'm talking of a period of not less than 250 years of
Yeah.
scholarly unanimity, scholarly consensus. This is what the Marxists did by adopting all these third-rated, underhand approaches to suit their own agenda. So let us look at history writing in the traditional sense. Okay, in the annals of Hindu understanding, it is called itihasa. Most of us are familiar now, thankfully, that it is split as iti plus ha plus hasa, meaning it happened thus, or a literal rendering of that. So we'll leave that aside. But Hindus who wrote about their own present or their past, it falls in several broad categories. One is the lineages, basically the family tree of or the dynastic history of major kings, major dynasties, scholars, other things. So you could you know deduce, form a broader picture of that era, the various epochs and incidents, the overall climate of that period. So that was one category of Hindu history writing. The second was, as Dushyant mentioned, all these inscriptions, grants, inscriptions, grants, all these also orders relating to different aspects of the administration or a military victory, that kind of thing. So you could derive history from those sources, and then the literary annals of that period. Like for example, you take
Right.
Kalidas, so you can reconstruct, pretty much a lot of aspects of the Gupta period. So this
Correct.
was one sources. Then on the other side, on the Muslim side, they were unabashed because Islam is essentially it is it is obsessed with its history, because both for Islam and Christianity, they have a specific starting point, which the scriptures say that this world was created by God on such and such a day at such and such an hour. So these are all
Correct.
literalist readings of history. So they are very obsessed about chronicling. What do they chronicle? Especially in the case of Muslim histories of India, they they are a chronicle of the victories of Islam in various lands, including infidel Hindustan.
Yeah.
So history writing or chronicling, I won't call it history, but okay, you can loosely use that word. Muslim chronicling, it emerged as a separate discipline, which was highly rewarding. So these
Right.
chroniclers, for example, it could be Al-Utbi, it could be Amir Khusro, all of these were also historians. Not only were the historians, they were also military warriors. So
Mm.
this aspect is rarely mentioned.
Yes.
So they, Vincent Smith says, all the exploits, of their sultans, who was also their patrons of these chroniclers. The savage exploits. This is not my words, but I'm paraphrasing Vincent Smith. He says the savageries and the barbarisms and brutalities inflicted on the masses of Hindus endeared their sultans to their bloodthirsty historians. This is what Vincent Smith writes.
Mm.
So anyway, they were obsessed with chronicling the military victories of Islam. So those
Right.
are also the primary sources for
Mm.
writing the
Mm.
history of India as well, especially the early
Mm.
medieval, all the way up to Tipu Sultan and the fall of the Mughal Empire and all the way. So you have
Mm.
about one entire millennium of primary sources that narrate
Right.
the truth of Islam in India itself. Now, you have truths written on both sides by
Correct.
actors drawn from their own sources. So then you get these brand of Marxists who deny what is inconvenient to them and glorify what is convenient to their ideology.
Mm.
So this is
So
not history. What Marxists wrote was not history, it was pure ideological and political pamphleteering, which had a specific purpose, intent, and goal. It
yeah,
is passed
I
on
totally
as
agree.
history.
No, and there is equal measure and there is evidence to that. And what many say is that if you look at the Razakars overnight turned communists the moment
Yes,
partition happened and the Nizam proceeded to Hyderabad. So a lot of these people walked into that ideology and claimed wore the communist yoga. But then what they did is that they got into these spaces and they
yeah,
were allowed to get into these spaces to start correcting and controlling the narrative.
yeah.
Rohit, my final question. It's been an amazing discussion so far, but I'm going to ask you this: is this all going to get stuck in politics? Is there a certain hesitancy to push through with it, or is there some willingness to show that this needs to be corrected for the benefit of our generations coming forward? Because there is a certain level, certain group which will resist. Like you said, the Congress has already picked up what was perhaps the smallest portion of your alterations and corrections, or one small portion, because it's politically convenient to them.
See, I am probably taking it to the logical conclusion. So definitely we are not going to let it go. So whatever this thing has happened, the revision process has happened. Definitely we are going to bring it to some kind of conclusion. And as I told you, Congress or any other party would be doing it for only for the political or election purpose. But
Hmm.
right now the ground is set. In Karnataka, you have one new what do you say wave of this thing. Uh, they have understood. So you might have heard that a lot of things are happening now. There is a halal issue, there is a hijab issue,
Yeah.
then there is this Tipu issue. But and in the middle of all these Kashmir files has come and gone. So there is a new kind of generation. I mean, a new thinking is emerging now, So
Hmm.
people have understood that all these years we have been taught all the wrong things in our history textbooks. And also, if you see the Karnataka intellectual debates, I
Hmm.
mean, Sandeep is very much a part of it. And there are many intellectuals. I'm not saying one section of intellectuals across all the ideologies, but there is a very good debate happening throughout the year. And I mean, a lot of good discussion is happening, and people have understood finally that all these years, leftists or Marxists, they have what do you say? They have mesmerized the people, and they have just given all wrong information to
Yeah.
the public in the name of textbooks or in the name of any other campaign.
Correct.
So people have understood, and they're open to all kind of ideas. They're open to the truth, and many people are interested in knowing the history. So they are going through a lot of texts apart from textbooks. And Tipu is, I mean, for last 4 or 5 years, this debate of Tipu is happening in Karnataka, and every time there is a Tipu Jayanti coming or any other issue that is related to Tipu coming up, people they go through the history, they understand a lot of atrocities happened by Tipu, and every time they dug up, so they come up with more and more facts. So I think
Hmm.
Karnataka is ready. The present generation is ready to accept the new, I mean, facts. It is ready to accept the truth.
Right.
And definitely, nobody is going to pay the tunes of intellectuals.
Well,
So
so
we are
let
going to bring to the logical conclusion. Definitely, these.
well, halal, hijab, and history, the three H's, perhaps will change the face, and Karnataka should be the beacon. And
I have a
if
final
it does
point.
it, then yeah, sure. Rest of India should follow. Yes, final word, Sandeep, and I'll wind up. Yeah.
Yeah, final word. I mean, it occurred just as Rohit was speaking that each time a government changes, no, BJP doesn't initiate these tampering or meddling in history change books, changes in history textbooks. What it is trying to do is undo the damage that has been done. So what does it
Yeah.
mean that a textbook will change when the Congress government comes to power? What do you mean writing personal opinion in a supposedly objective field? Discipline, an
Correct.
academic discipline. Meaning,
No,
why
but
don't
that's
they
the
go
thing.
ahead? Yeah. So why don't
But
they?
that,
What history remains then? Why don't they
correct.
openly
But
go ahead and say that we are making this change in the history because we want Muslim votes? What history are we
no,
talking about?
no, they will not say that openly, and they should not say that. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? You have to
Yeah,
give credit where it is due. That they are past masters in spinning the narrative.
yeah.
Dushyant, final 1 minute I'll give you because, and then I have to be fair to everybody. So Dushyant, and then we'll
Good.
wind up. Yeah,
Okay.
you're on mute, Dushyant. Yeah, go ahead.
Anand, since we are talking in general about history and how that needs to be presented in schools and colleges, and we are also talking about a specific topic called Tipu. So, this Tipu controversy has been there since 2015. Until about
Correct.
2015, while I was a student, I still used to call him the tiger of Mysore, and I didn't have a photo of him, portrait of him, where I would do aradhana for him. But still, that's the way I was taught. Now the point of discussion is why should Tipu Jayanti be celebrated or not celebrated is not with respect to Tipu. It is with respect to the religion which he adhered. So that's the point where it boils down to. That's where I honestly, sincerely feel as a practicing Hindu. Every religion will carry its own set of interpretations, misinterpretations, some beliefs which are okay, some which may be detrimental to a society for a long period of time.
Right.
It is in the hands of the people following that religion to bring about a transformation in the religion. Similarly, I, as a practicing Hindu, I will not criticize any religion for that matter. But one thing that I would put forth as a request to people following the religions of the West who are practicing in India is if you feel that there are certain places where you can bring a transformation in the way people, the minds of the people, then it will be a big blessing for the generations to come. A simple example is if a certain book calls kafir as a person who doesn't believe in their form or ideology of religion, probably people practicing those religion, I'm no person to recommend, it's just a request. They can probably say from now on, let's call kafir a person who works against humanity in general. Then what will happen is they will start embracing the entire world as their family. Until they keep the stringent definitions what was practiced in the 6th and the 7th century in the 21st century, then probably even I am a kafir as much as you are.
Yeah.
So that definition, if it changes, then probably, there'll be more inclusivity, and then I will start thinking them as my own, they will start thinking me as their own, and we will be in for a better world to live in. So this is just a request. So through Tipu Jayanti controversy, something that we as people in India, I'm not talking about countries outside India, we as people who have always welcomed change and transformation, if we do that, if my fellow brothers and sisters accept such interpretations, come up with new, better, inclusive interpretations, then probably all
Yeah.
religions can be in this world.
It's ironical, but Islam is new religion, and it is supposed to be. It actually evolved. Many scholars say it evolved over 200 years, where a lot of processes were changed, a lot of things were amended, but suddenly it stopped. It was put an end to, and a lot of the reforms were also done away with. And then they said, no, let's just go back to be absolutely hardline. And some it's ironical that by the sword, conversion by the sword is actually bidat. You're not supposed to do it. But sadly, that's what's been championed by the historians, like Sandeep was saying. So it's ironical, but very engaging discussion. Rohit, great job done, and I hope you continue to muster on and muscle on. People like Dushan Caesar, Sandeep Palkrishna, we need more of you teaching
Thank
in
you.
the classes the right
Thank
history and the right perspective. Thank you very, very much.
you.
Namaskara to all.
Namaskar.